Patriot Smoothie here. I am at the courthouse for day 13 of the trial of Tamara, Lich and Chris Barber. It's going to be a shorter day and then we're going on break. The trial will be breaking for 2 weeks, I believe. I'll report back at the end of the day with the exact dates. Before we get into this, guys, if you've appreciated the work that's gone into this, keeping you up to date, if you appreciate the work I've done, please consider supporting me by e-transfer. The address at the bottom of the screen, realpatriotsmoothie@protonmail.com. Thank you so much for watching, liking, sharing, getting this out. People need to know what's going on. So lots to get through. We're going to recap yesterday. So yesterday we had Greenspun cross-examining Kim Ayotte. We learned that during the February 13 meeting between truckers, police, and city, somebody's notes said, subject to police operational plan, protesters will be staying on Wellington indefinitely. Ayotte says he disagrees, even though that's in the minutes, but if he didn't take any notes. Again, sorry guys, there's a lot to get through, so I will be reading it a little bit today. So Ayotte does not know, he does not have the maps, these maps that were made of where the trucks could go on Wellington. He didn't have them. There was questions about them. They're not there. He said that it was in the thousands of pages of disclosure to POEC, and the judge said therefore it should be pretty easy to access them. It should be easy to get. We'll see. Then the February 13th meeting is the only time Ayotte ever met with any of the protesters. That's interesting. And then there was another meeting before that with Police Chief Peter Slowly, former Police Chief Ottawa, and Steve Kaliakos, Steve K, former city manager for the city of Ottawa, where it was documented in those notes of that meeting that 50 holdout truckers had agreed to move. So it seemed like things were really coming together, and that was of course in reference to the deal being brokered between the mayor's office, the protesters, by intermediary Steve French, who was formerly with the premier's office acting as a good faith broker of sorts, if you will. And then Ayotte agreed that at the February 13th meeting, he understood that everything south of Wellington would be moved out of the residential areas, whether that be to Wellington, whether that be to another staging area, whether that be out of town. Ayotte understood that from the February 13th meeting. However, he disagrees with what Mr. Arpin later testified, that all of those trucks, the city believed that all of those trucks could fit onto Wellington. Now, Mr. Ayotte is the current general manager for emergency services and preparedness for the city of Ottawa. So he had a heavy hand in preparing that and to explaining to the mayor's office where trucks could fit, where they couldn't fit. And Mr. Arpin testified both at the POEC and yesterday. Mr. Arpin, former chief of staff to former Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson, he testified, Mr. Arpin, after Ayotte, that he was told by the city that all the trucks, the majority of them, could fit on Wellington. That's something that Ayotte disagrees with, but he has no notes in any of the documents indicating that disagreement at the time. Interesting. Ayotte testified that when the vehicles began moving on February 14th, once they moved, the area was secured by police and not retaken by protesters. The Crown went back to this during cross-examination, and Mr. Ayotte changed his testimony here slightly concerning that. Interesting. So and then generally the city and Mr. Ayotte saw the first day of the operation, February 14th, as a success. We later learned, so it was 40 heavy trucks, but as Magus got out, that there was actually 102 vehicles that were moved. Mr. Ayotte later described that as leapfrogging, as jockeying, that some of the smaller vehicles would try to get into where the big trucks moved. But earlier again, he's testified that when Greenspun asked him that once an area was left by protesters and police secured it, it was not retaken. So some contradictory testimony there in a way, and that 102 vehicles total, including the 40 heavy vehicles, were moved on day one, and that represented about 25% of the vehicles that were in the residential zones. So arguably a good faith effort there. That's my commentary. And on the 15th, in text messages with Barber, Barber indicated that he wore himself out moving these vehicles. What time are we at?
4:06.
Okay, and Barber indicated that he wore himself out moving these vehicles, but he had rested up and he would get back at it today. Then the decision was arbitrarily made by the police, who again, as we learned, manages all protests and has to make all operational decisions. The decision made by the police and not shared with the city for the reasons why, but just shared that there's no more trucks moving. The protesters, Barber, were ready to keep going on day 2, the 15th of the deal. That would be day 2 of the deal, but then police saying, nope, not happening. That's where we were. Greenspun asked Ayotte about his affidavit he swore at 7:49 p.m. on February 13th to help the city get the injunction against the trucks. In that affidavit, Ayotte swore that the protesters were not being cooperative. He later described that as a non-cooperative tone. despite the meeting an hour or so before he swore that affidavit, where there was arguably quite a lot of cooperation on the 13th. The city even provided pizza because, as they put it, by that point it was a done deal. They just had to work out the logistics in the operational area, and the city believed that the convoy organizers there had an influence over a wide center, like a wide, broad center of the moderate protesters who were there to end mandates. So they believed they were negotiating with somebody who had influence. They weren't wasting their time, and then they were even having this pizza meeting on the 13th to celebrate this accomplishment. And then all of a sudden, good faith gone out the window. And 7:30, there's an affidavit sworn that there's no cooperation for protesters. Cooperative tone, mind you. So that's where we're at with that. The decision. So again, it was testified also that the protesters did not renege on that deal at any point. The decision to stop the trucks was made by the police. The moving of trucks, they didn't want to do it anymore. So Greenspun, and again, he testified that it was a successful day, that the 14th of February, IOT testifying that was seen as a successful day. 40 big trucks, 102 vehicles in total. That's a success. 25% of the trucks in residential areas. And in the affidavit, IOT also did not mention blocked emergency lanes. No mention anywhere in that city injunction or his affidavit for the injunction that there was blocked emergency lanes. So interesting fact that was brought up on Cross by Greenspun. He also admitted that the private horn injunction of February 17th was in place by that time the affidavit was sworn on February 13th, and that the honking had become sporadic, to use Mr. IOT's words, by that time. There was no mention of the deal with the protesters in the affidavit, the deal that had been brokered just an hour or two before the sworn affidavit, and that IOT did not mention in the affidavit at the meeting, he did not mention that affidavit to the meeting with protesters. He didn't bring it up, so he did that, good faith agreement. I think Steve K was there, different people were there, everyone's happy, and then an hour later goes and swears this affidavit that there's no cooperative tone, as he later testified that it was, and that there was all these situations going on stopping bylaw from doing their enforcement, despite the good faith deal that had been brokered and exercised in good faith on February 14th, stopped by police by the 15th. So all operational decisions circling back into protest made by the police. Greenspun asked, if that was not the case, you wouldn't have to bring this application, and IOT agreed. Again, the Crown going back to this specifically in the cross-examination, trying to clarify, and IOT later testifying the specificities of his agreement to that condition when he testified, but generally agreeing with Greenspun on Cross that the police were in control of bylaw enforcement, that the bylaw could not do anything without the police accompanying them. He also testified that it was for public officer safety, but then testifying that yes, it was the policy that the police had total jurisdiction over the protest and any enforcement action that happened, ticketing, towing, whatever. And Greenspun described it as his guys not being able to do his job, and actually IOT pretty much agreed with that, but then said the injunction the city got from his affidavit on the 13th gave them an additional toolbox, a higher level of enforcement or something in the courts, as he testified by that, another tool in the toolbox. But then again, he also testified it did not change the operational situation. The police were still making all those enforcement decisions, and his guys arguably were still not out there doing the things that he wanted them to do. So we'll see. And Greenspun said that the police got so much control over your guys, they couldn't even ticket people because of police. And then he said yes, and for public safety of officers, bylaw couldn't do their job without police approval. Yeah. So Serge Arpin, the former chief of staff to former Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson, as we went over, testified about the process. Most of his testimony was about the process of forming that February 13th letter the letter from the mayor's office, which he drafted. There was exchanges with Steve K over the draft that Mr. Arpin did, and then there was the stamp affixed to it from the mayor's office once it met all the preconditions that Mayor Watson had for this letter. And then of course the deal on the 13th, where there was actually a physical meeting at City Hall with protesters in the city, and I believe also Sergeant Drummond of the Ottawa Police was there as well. All right, Arpin, so this is another interesting point. Arpin described during his testimony yesterday 5 or 6 walks he took into the convoy. He testified that at some points in those walks he felt uncomfortable. There was several defense objections requiring Arpin to leave the room. Defense argued feelings will not lead to facts. The judge allowed the question the Crown was trying to ask, but not per se, wanted it rephrased. And the judge elaborated that sometimes facts could lead to observations. Sometimes feelings can lead to facts in certain circumstances. Arpin described the idling of trucks, making it difficult to have conversations beside those trucks. because he was asked about some of the things he directly observed, and he was saying, okay, well, the idling of trucks when the truck was in operation, it was making a lot of noise, it was spewing fumes, and then he was asked, okay, well, what did that do? And he's like, well, you couldn't have a conversation besides the idling 18-wheeler, as he said. And then he also, so again, a lot of arguments, objections from defense requiring Arpin to leave the room, not quite as much as I ought on his first or second day when he got those 10,000 steps in, but there was some progress there. And the judge allowed, like I said, so, and he also described that him and the mayor's staff were unable to attend an outdoor patio in the vicinity of the protests because of the idling and the noise and the fumes. So Arpin could only describe one of those 5 or 6 walks in any detail. Greenspun expressed frustration with the way the witness was providing evidence, not according to what he was told would be said. So basically, he has this, outline of what the witness is going to say, and then the witness comes in and talks about a whole bunch of different things. And that's not what Greenspun was prepared to talk about. It's like almost unrelated testimony in a way. Is kind of what I picked up on that argument there. And Greenspun also argued that the Crown didn't even know what the witness was going to say. He went as far as to say that. He's like, I bet you the Crown doesn't even know what this witness is about to testify to. And then the Crown said something along the lines of, I know what he's going to testify to because I know this file, or something. That's what we had back and forth in the court there. And so again, going back here, the Crown stopped their chief so they stopped their chief examination after several defense objections. They may resume that today, or we may get back to the cross. The Crown asked for a ruling on witnesses so they can continue to call them, the so-called admissions 2 argument. And then Greenspun saying that if he knew, he would have added Ayat and Arpin to his admissions argument to exclude the witnesses if he knew that their testimony would be impact, as he said. So that's where we're at with that. And today we will sit until 1 p.m. It will be a bit of a shorter day, and we will discuss the logistics of when we're coming back in 2 weeks. Justin Perkins McVeigh indicating that she will not decide on the admissions 2 argument today. She said she wanted to give the decision more consideration, considering the breadth of the arguments the defense counsel and Crown have made to her on that. So she wants to make sure the decision reflects that amount of effort. Thank you from Ottawa. I'm Patriot Smoothie.